Hi everyone. As a substitute for the webinar that we won't have, the last webinar for the OD1 module this term, I said that I would do a video to brief you on the third assessment. So the third assessment is a case study as indicated here in the left panel, left window, and it is due, I think it's the 14th of November, which should be next Monday, not tomorrow, the next Monday. So the maximum word count of 2,200 words, and as you know, you may go up to 2,200 words. Also, what you should perhaps consider is, or what you should know is that you also shouldn't be more than 10% below that word count of 2,000, okay? So the various, call it penalties, rules are below the rubric for the assessment. The rubric is quite comprehensive and it deals with each of the questions and sub-questions, so you can see exactly what we're looking at in terms of the assignment when we grade them according to this rubric. So the assessment instructions is that you should read the case study 2, which is the turnaround strategy of Sasol Mining. It is in the textbook Van Tonder and Rood on page 396, and then you should answer these various questions that I will get into now. So I just want to quickly show you the case study. I think I've got that open over here. So this is the case study that I copied out of the textbook, and I've posted this for you on the on my SACAP under the assessments tab. So this is the case study. It's a very short case study, but there's a lot of information there that you can work with. Actually, it looks like 3 pages. Why did I think it was 2? So it's 1 full page there, another page over there, yeah, and then, yeah, 2, almost 3 pages. Okay. But it's still relatively short. So I uploaded that for you, and I uploaded that for you. Let me show you. So this is my screen. Your screen will look a bit different. I've got the educator screen in which I can do a lot of edits. So the assessment 3 Sasol case study is in there under the assessments tab, as is your assessment 3 answer template, which I will again briefly go through at the end of this video. So you've got all the information there, and then so let's get back to the particulars of the assessment. The first question is what elements of the action research process the action research process is what we looked at in session 4. So which of those elements can be observed in a manner in which the unfolding change process in the organization was dealt with? And in answering this question, ensure that you provide supporting evidence from the case study information. So just a quick pause here. So please, it's a case study, so your answers must not be all theoretical. You can refer to perhaps very quickly what the action research process is, but you should then answer the question in the context of the of the case information. Furthermore, I would urge you to remain primarily engaged with the two textbooks in answering all of these questions as poly-based theory, and then you would answer the various questions as I mentioned in terms of the case study context. They shouldn't be abstract, sort of reasoning. You can have basic reasoning around action research, as I mentioned as an example, but you must contextualize it with the case information. And that being said, if I quickly return to the word count for the assessment, although we will treat you empathetically if you 10% below the 2,000 word count, in our experience and my experience with this assignment and many other assignments in other modules, is that students that tend to write less than, for example, in this case, 2,000. So you could, without penalty, go to 1,800 words. My experience is that more than likely you haven't fully answered the questions and you are likely not to perform very well in the assessment. I'm not saying that there aren't students that can write very effectively in 1,800 words, but that's the exception rather than the rule. So I urge you to not try and minimize, read the questions properly and answer them properly. So the first question, in what elements of the research process studied in session 4 of this module can be observed in a manner in which the unfolding change process in the organization was dealt with? And as I mentioned in answering the question, ensure that you provide supporting evidence from the case study information. So this is a full 15 marks. That's a lot of marks. And you will then go to the material in session 4, look at the action research material. You can start maybe with my overall summary of in my slides around the action research process. But I also would take it for granted that you would have read around that with all the prescribed reading and that you've made that your own. So you need to be very familiar with the process. Okay, so the action research process. Let me just briefly show you the. Okay, we'll move through the module outline. So the session 4 is action research and appreciative inquiry. So you'll find the information around the action research element of this particular question 1, in and around the material that you would have studied in this session. And I've got my slide session. Where is that now? 3, 4, 3, 7, 8, 4. Here we go. So I've got several slides which outlines the various steps. So let me just quickly with you on a line, just go here and see where does it start. Yeah. So here is the sort of 4 themes around action research. So you should be very familiar with this, and then also with the various steps which I laid out here and which is expanded upon much more in detail in the textbook. So there are various stages which you should be aware of in answering this question. So the stages in the textbook again, and I've got a brief summary of them here. Various stages, stage 7, 8, and then there are some closing stages, and you know and if some information in and around the action research methodology in the slides and in the reading for the session 4. So you should be very familiar with that to be able to answer the question. And then in the case study itself, you will, and this goes for all the questions, applies for all the questions. So the case study, you can't do a case study by just reading it quickly and then, sort of go to the questions and try and answer them. I would also caution you against going to the questions and seeing what the question is and then trying to find something in a case study that you can kind of refer to and so on. So my advice to you is to read the case study a few times and then put it aside and get going with some other work that you have for SACAP or anything else. Then come back to this and read it again, maybe making some notes about what you see in a case study, and even a third, even putting it down for the second time and then coming back to it either the next day or several hours later. In the meantime, your brain would have processed the information in the background without you even knowing it. So that third time, let's say that you read it, you then sort of close down the sort of several reading process, and then you can start systematically with the various questions. And for the various questions, you may find information in any of the text around the 3 pages here. And then one of your focal points will also be the change model that the business CEO, I think it was the CEO or the MD that drove this project, the MD, Mr. Rian Rademan, and his change process is outlined over here, and then all the text around that explains what he did, and you should be able to pick up from all of that the elements of the action research process that you observed in working through that case study, and also referring to that change process as I just showed you, the change process in the case study. And then the second element of session 4 that comes into play in this assessment is the appreciative inquiry approach. So the question is for 5 marks, and let me quickly pause the word breakdown, the maximum of 2,000 words, as I mentioned, under and over 10%. So, 2,200 words would more than likely be a relatively good piece of work. But the mark allocation you can use as a sort of a rough indicator of the proportionate word allocation for each of the questions. I think they all add up to 100, 15, 20, 30, 40, 50, 65, 80, and then 90. Where is there something else? Let me just see here quickly. I think there's 10 marks. There are 10 marks for APA format and academic usage. So your word breakdown for a little bit of quick maths will be 15 marks would be 15 divided by 90 times 2,000 will give you the allocation for this question, and so on and so forth. In my grading, my answer template, I've allocated the various sections and headings that I've got in there with that calculation in mind, and allocating the word count accordingly. So that's just the thing around that. So at what stage might appreciative inquiry have been useful? And then also don't just say stage whatever. You've got to motivate your answer as to why you say so. So again, the case study, you would work through that, as I mentioned several times, reading and maybe 2 or 3 cycles of that, and you would then have a very good idea of what happened here, and you could, knowing the principles behind appreciative inquiry, you would then be able, hopefully, to make an assessment as to where in this, the whole process that's explained in these 3 pages, and that you can also refer to this diagram as also some of the information for you. Where would appreciative inquiry have been helpful? So if you go to appreciative inquiry, where is that again? Session 4. So in here you would, let's see, where's the action research. So yeah, the appreciative inquiry, and I've got a few slides around that. I'm just going to show you this one, so you can understand the origins of, by now you would have read and studied the material. You would know the origins, and what shines through in the material around appreciative inquiry is the approach of looking for what is good in a system, like an organizational system. So the focus isn't on problem solving, it is on uncovering the energy of people that are striving to do good things. And so you build upon what the organization have done well, and then finding pieces around that can be continued forward and even built upon as a strong positive base for the organization. So this MD identified problems with the organization, but there may also have been an opportunity in this whole process described in the case study where it may have been useful for him to employ, or the OD consultant employed to work there, contracted to work there, to have some form of an appreciative inquiry intervention to uncover those positives among the problems of the, there are problems, but we also want to have a positive intervention looking at the positives, more or less, around the appreciative inquiry process, where you focus on the positives. So if you understand the appreciative inquiry approach and that focus on the positive, you would likely find somewhere in that case study where you would be able to apply the method. And saying that, a case study, each of you will read it maybe slightly differently. We bring our own subjectivity to issues. Hopefully you would be bringing enough of your knowledge that you've studied so far around the topic to have some degree of objectivity. But let me get to the point I want to make, is that at what stage in a change process might an appreciative inquiry approach have been useful? So we don't have a model answer for that stage. We're wanting you to motivate your answer for where in that whole process you would have applied the appreciative inquiry approach, because there could have been perhaps several areas or stages where you could have applied this, and then you might think may apply that, and then you need to make a call where maybe best it can be where it can be best applied at what stage. So student A may have it at stage 4 or whatever it is, and another student may have motivated for it to be better at, let's say, there's a stage 2 or wherever. So yeah, we don't have a model answer. The important point is here that you motivate your answer. Okay. So then the case study number 3, the case study information does not provide any specific evidence of diagnosis undertaken, bearing in mind the change targets listed in the case study. So the change targets listed in the case study, and And if you had been the HR/OD professional supporting the business at the time, at what stage would you say diagnosis could have proved useful? Motivate your own answers. So let me just go back to the module outline and then organizational diagnosis we dealt with in session 8. So let me see if I can quickly show you some slides around session 8, 8. And you would be able to, I mean, this is, there are several slides here, go through the slides here and understand, hopefully you already understand diagnosis, but you've got to answer the question demonstrating that you understand the issue of diagnosis and where it would have taken place. So you can look at the material in the slides and also in your textbook or prescribed material to find the necessary stage where you would say diagnosis could have proved useful. So there would probably be generally a logical place in terms of the case study context where diagnosis could have proved useful more than likely than other places. But again, you have some leeway here. If you can motivate your answer in terms of the purpose of diagnosis and the particulars of the case study and how that unfolded, there is some leeway for you. So again, there's not a particular model answer, but there is probably, in context of the case, more logical places than other cases in the stages in the context of the case study. Then also in the diagnosis material that you will have, there would be material around what would the objectives of the diagnosis have been in that case. And let me just, in any event, go back to these slides. I think I've got a few slides around that comes really straight from the textbook. Process. Let's see if I can find that scanning, sensing. Or is it a bit higher up? Sure, it's over here. Let me just quickly, with you on the line, quickly run through this. So explain the role, purpose, focus. So that it would be somewhere in that outcome. Okay. So perhaps you can find some guidance around the purpose, objective, goal of the diagnosis. Okay, nature of diagnosis, nature, greatest, nature of diagnosis, nature of the diagnosis. Yeah, here we go. There's a slide here that I think it's more than one slide. Let me just see. Yeah, there are a few slides here that you may find useful, and then also it's obviously in the textbook as noted on top here, chapter 7 of Van Tonder and Rood. So here are typical objectives. So what would be the objective of this diagnosis? And the objectives listed here, we're not talking about several of these applying in the context of the case study, but there may be 2 or 3. I wouldn't really go to more than that sort of level, even 2, 3, that is relevant to the context of the case study, and you can find the material in chapter 7, and there's a summary of it over here. Noting here the list of possible diagnostic objectives can range from the fairly general to more specific and concrete. So you have to know the information, the reading and the material to be able to mindfully apply your knowledge to the case study. Okay. Also to bear in mind in terms of the objective is that the choices relating to the focus and scope of the initiative are informed by the needs of the client and or the present state of the organization. So you need to know the case study very well and then understand the dynamics around the role of a diagnosis and what kind of objectives you can look at. So, okay, so that is the what stage the diagnosis could have proved useful, spoken about that, and what would the objectives of the diagnosis be. And then in line with the above objectives in B, what diagnostic framework would you have selected and how would you have applied it? Okay, so this question here, diagnostic, is really very intense, if I can put it that way. It's 30 marks out of, it's a third of the 90 marks, because diagnosis is such a cornerstone of organizational development interventions. You need to be able to demonstrate your understanding very well here. So in line with the above objectives, what diagnostic framework would you have selected and how would you have applied it? So the diagnostic framework, I think we dealt with that in, let me just make sure, in, was it session 5? Yeah. Yeah, it's session 5, Core Theories and Models, Part 1. And let me just quickly go to slides for session 5. Okay, here we go. So in session 5, you must be familiar with the material that we prescribed and have studied that. But the diagnostic model, there are some of them described in that in a reading for that chapter, but the Burke-Litwin model, adaptive of organizational performance and change, is an example of a diagnostic model. So a diagnostic model usually works on a basis of what are the elements and issues in an organization that determines its performance. So the Burke-Litwin model, adapted by the authors with a few elements, which they explain in the textbook, the environment and the context of an organization they would be in an external environment, there would be leadership in a business, there would be organizational culture, there would be a vision, mission, and strategy, and all of these other elements. Okay, so make sure that you understand this model or the others in there, and then choose which one would best fit. So the diagnosis would be, there would be interviews with people, there could be questionnaires, survey questionnaires. The OD consultants might do some observation about behavior in your organization, and then for each of these elements, they will assess the effectiveness or the degree to which that either leans towards making the organization more successful, or which they each lean to possibly undermine the effectiveness of the organization. And having done all of this, they then produce a report which they discuss with management and discuss the various assessments around motivation was like this, equipment, management practices, these are identified, and maybe these don't work so well seemingly, and so on. And then, so that's formed part of the diagnosis. In other words, like a doctor, what is, inverted commas, wrong with the organization, what is wrong with the patient, and then the interventions and so on are designed around that, and various options will be arrived at, and the OD consultants, with the blessing of the organizational people that drive the OD, that contracted for the OD program process, would then agree to that and give their support to the interventions, and they would then have interventions to fix, for lack of another expression, some of those areas that are not currently working to the well-being, for the well-being of the organization. And then diagnosis, there's also a return to diagnosis after a period of time to kind of track performance. In other words, did things improve? So the diagnostic model can be applied as well again. So I sidetracked slightly, but the information, the model is the diagnostic model, which looks something like this, and there are others. This is one example, and you'll find that in session 5. So, so in line with the above objectives, which is 3C, in line with the above objectives, what diagnostic framework would you have selected, and how would you have applied it? I gave you a very brief overview of that, but make sure that you answer it in a more sophisticated way, perhaps, than what I have ad-libbed around that here. Okay. Then question 4, how does the change and transformation process described in the case study, remember that diagram? So that diagram was their process, and then all the text before and after that diagram explained what they did in this process. So the question here is, how does the change and transformation process described in the case study compare with the planned change approaches studied in session 6 of this module? Okay, so then in answering this question, discuss the strengths and the limitations of the change process applied in a case study as you see them. Okay, so you would sort of essentially, this is also a 15-mark question. You can see it's a heavy allocation. You would use the planned change approaches and a particular model that we studied in session 6 as your base. And compare the company's process, which is that the diagram and then all the explanations around that, against the session 6 theoretical model, and then evaluating the strengths and limitations of the change process applied in a case study as you see them. So, for example, you may identify that from the theoretical model that we studied in session 6, which, let's say, deals with A, in the model that the company used, that particular phase or step seems to have not been included, or perhaps there is only a very small effort in that regard, and therefore, that might have been a weakness of the Sasol change model, and so on and so forth. And then you would also highlight, we'll also identify the model at the phase called that, and that is aligned with whatever the model is in session 6 that you're going to be talking to, and that was well done. That was the strength of the approach of the company. Okay, and you would motivate that. So you've got 15 marks there. So the session 6, I just want to make sure that I guide you properly there. So session 6, there we go. So probably the model that is sort of most relevant here would be the Kotter model, but I want to show you one of the earlier models before Kotter, which was, if you have worked through those prescribed material, you would have seen that Lewin was one of the, my words, the fathers of organizational development, and his famous model was unfreezing, moving to a new situation, and refreezing, and this work in the sort of metaphor of if you have square ice blocks and you want to have round ice blocks, so you have square ones, but you want round ones. You first have to unfreeze the ice blocks to make them water. You would put them in the molds to have round ice blocks, and then you would put it back in a freezer to freeze. So you have changed from square blocks to round blocks. So this is a very traditional model in the OD sort of literature. My understanding of some of the criticisms against this particular simplistic three-phase model is that there are so much change in organizations these days that to have, like, let's say, a full phase of unfreezing, moving to a new situation and then refreezing, it is far more dynamic than what this implies. So that's just very briefly background, and then the model that built on that, the Kotter's 8-step plan for leading organizational change, is probably the model that I would suggest that you use as for that question. John Kotter built on Lewin's model to create a more detailed approach for leading organizational change. Maybe let's just pause here for a moment, is that this model must be contrasted against the model that we spoke about earlier, which is a diagnostic model. So the diagnostic model looks at the issues in the organization based on a framework or theoretical model of an organization with all the elements of the organization, and then you investigate each of them through interviews or surveys or whatever and arrive at the diagnosis of what are the issues. So the Kotter model, the model that we're talking about here, is an overall model that the business and the OD consultant can use to manage all the processes, all the change interventions and so on with the stakeholders within the organization. So this is not a diagnostic model. This is, let's say, call it a management model of how you are going to manage the change process in the business on a basis of that you want to change based on the model that you used previously to do diagnosis. You must understand that distinction. And then the model here is 8 steps, and it's laid out here, Kotter's 8-step model, and then there's detail. I'm not going to go into the detail here now. There's plenty of material in that session. I've given you added material and obviously the textbook, which I think it's an important model for you to understand very well. The management steps for leading organizational change or managing organizational change. I should stay there. And you can see how the textbook have framed the 8 steps of Kotter within the paradigm of Lewin's unfreeze, move to a new situation, and refreeze. So this is probably the model that I would suggest you use, and you will now compare these 8 steps and see how they perhaps were implemented, or how the plan that the organization uses to manage change, broadly speaking, that diagram that's in the case study, how does that process compare to this ideal, call it the ideal theoretical model? Okay, and there's a lot of practice behind this theoretical model, and this model has been used countless times in organizational change processes in one form or the other. So you will be comparing the case study process against this for that particular question. So let's get back to the question, which is number 4. How does the change and transformation process described in a case study compare with the planned change approach studied in session 6 of this model? So I would, as I said, the planned change approaches, I would suggest that you use the Kotter one, and then evaluate the case study accordingly and earn your marks here. Bearing in mind, the writer here, in answering this question, discussed the strengths and limitations of the change process applied in the case study. Then the case study provides question 5, also 15 marks. The case study provides information on support that was provided from a psychosocial and culture perspective. And then what question 5 wants you to do is to identify and describe some specific human resource management interventions that could have been applied and explain why these would have been useful in providing ongoing support for to the employees. So here again, we don't have a model answer that says these are the 3 process interventions that the student should have identified. No, but there would probably be principles around this question that you need to understand to be able to motivate your interventions. Okay, so it also says identify and describe some specific interventions. So you have only so many words to work with, so 2, maybe 3, and then describe them, motivate them very well, explain why they would have been useful. So okay, you be the judge of that. So I've got a slide on that, and there's material in a textbook that will give you kind of an idea of human resource management intervention. So I think this was session 3. Let me just go to the slides for session 3 and let's see. Yeah, so session 3, the prescribed material, please do work through that. So when I worked through the Van Tonder chapter 13, I identified what might be seen as a selection of OD interventions with an HR, HRM, HR development related implications. So broadly speaking, they could be perhaps labeled as HR type of interventions. And I've listed them, or not, I've briefly described all of them over here. So it's the best interest that you work through the slides and then write your answer. So I just want to find maybe one example that that could be maybe sense to you. Organization, restructuring. Okay, so interventions in a structural subsystem, delayering or downsizing. I think this is, broadly speaking, that will have an implication on human resources, because if you delay and downsize, there may be layoffs, there may be flattening of organizational structures, which mean some people that previously maybe have had management positions now no longer do or won't have. And that's got certain implications in terms of people motivation and so on. So work through that, and then job design, perhaps maybe that would have been, but you need to again look at the context of the case study and what would be relevant interventions from that perspective. And it may even be that if you can find other resources, as I mentioned, use your prescribed material as the foundation of your work. Don't just go to any old website to motivate or to say what they've said around various issues. So use the text material, prescribed material. But if you do find in the research process that you undertake a consulting company or an OD website with credibility, and they maybe describe some specific human resource development intervention, HR focused interventions that would perhaps fit the context of the case study, then by all means also bring that in. Okay. Then role negotiation, broadly, responsibility charting, you can see what that's all about. So a very specific I think human resources intervention, I think, would be performance management. So the company, the Sasol company, had some very significant problems, hence the OD process was implemented, undertaken. They undertook the process, the OD thing. And so perhaps a very logical intervention would have been to re-examine the company's performance management system, and how that can be used to support, to drive people at particular objectives that are aligned with what the company would be aiming at, in line with the various plans that are to adapt, or strategies or whatever, to fit the environment where they can resolve all those issues. And among others, performance management, revised plan, process, system might have been a useful element. But you decide. You need to articulate again a little bit more than what I'm ad-libbing here as I move through the various slides and trying to help you. Yeah, also organizational culture subsystem. It's got a lot of people focus, but this tends to, I suppose, be more organizational issue rather than a pure HR. The performance management was like more of a pure HR intervention, but the organizational culture subsystem also will have people underpin the organizational culture, and we need to work with people to shift culture. So there may be an HR angle in there somewhere. Values clarification. What else do I have here? Learning organization. Okay, so have I got anything else here? No. Yeah, so okay, so have a look at that question, and with this as sort of a broad background as to what we're looking for there. So identify and describe, question 5, some specific human resource management interventions. So see what you can find that are credible out there, if you can't find it in a textbook, and then please define your, I think the emphasis here is on specific human resource management interventions. So that might possibly disqualify culture as one. But you make the call. If you understand the material and you research a little bit around human resource management interventions in an OD context, please make the call and then identify those, I don't know, 2, 3 interventions or so. Probably not more than that. And then if you had been the question 6, if you had been the HROD professional called upon to provide support to the case study organizational change, reflect on and describe the process you would have put in place to enter into and manage the relationship with the client system. And here again, you need to have a very intimate knowledge of the prescribed material, and then particularly some of the material in the session where we looked at the organizational development process, which is over here, session 7. So I want to just very briefly again see if I can pick up anything from the slides that might be useful to you. Session 7 over here. So the phases of the process, and one of the very starting phases here is entry and contracting. So if we look at the question, it says, if you had been the HROD professional called upon to provide support to the case study organizational change, reflect on and describe the process you would have put in place to enter, okay, which is entry and contracting. I would label it as entry and contracting. Okay, contracting is kind of obviously associated with entry. need to understand the dynamics that are at play in this particular issue. Okay, in the textbook is very explicit about some of the dynamics around that, and your credibility as the OD consultant and your ability to manage the stakeholders in that entry process. So that's a specific part of this question, enter into. And then there's a specific follow-up on that. The second part to question 6 is what process would you have put in place to enter, and then also what process would you have put in place to manage the relationship with the client system. Maybe it could have been one broad process where you would have a subsystem for entry and a subsystem for manage the relationship, because manage the relationship with the client system implies management throughout some of these interventions take years, but whether it's 6 months, a year, or 2 years, or whatever it is, I can't remember the time frame around the Sasol case study, but the OD consultant need to be able to manage the relationship with the client system. And what is implied here as well, or even quite explicit, is the OD consultant needs to be able to manage all the stakeholders in the organization. And the textbook shows the various talks to the various stakeholders, and some stakeholders will be, let's say, primary stakeholders, and others will be more secondary stakeholders, but there are a whole bunch of stakeholders that you need to be able to manage. And stakeholders really mean the OD process and everything related to that has an impact on everyone in the organization, and maybe for some more than others, but how are they impacted, particular stakeholders, and how do you need to manage them, your relationship to them. You need to be very, very specific about that. So stakeholders would be employees, it could be unions, it's top management, and so on. So you need to also understand the context of the stakeholder relationships in addition to the entry into the process, okay? So that's 10 marks. So that is the case study question, due to 2,000 words and so on. So let me just quickly go to the, I think that's the last bit over there. You can go back to the slides for the various sessions as I demonstrated, and to the primary information in your textbooks. And let me just go to the template. This is the template. So this is the Sasol Mining case study answer template. Please do use this. I will so this is the, hopefully you can see this on your perhaps smaller screens. Yeah, so let me rather just make it slightly bigger so that you've got the document, so you can obviously just download it, and hopefully you've already done so. Took a look at it. So that's the covering page. This should be 14 November, okay, so better change that, okay. And then the table of contents, and you would by now hopefully know how to update it. So you would write your assessment, and every now and then you may want to see what your table of contents look like, and you would then update the field, and you would say update entire table, and you would then update it. Those are the headings that I put in there to guide you, which basically just follows the headings, the questions from 1 to 6 in the module outline. Suggest you write a very short conclusion to everything. You'll have a list of references, and bearing in mind, again, I want to emphasize, don't just go to any old website. You need to be able to find credible websites, but primarily, please do have a foundational set of references along the 2 textbooks and the other reading that we supply or prescribe, if they are relevant in the context of the assessment. So that's the elements. and then there will be a very short introduction, a few words that you allocate to that, 54 words in this case, and then the elements that will carry the marks will come in next. The reason why you need to have the short introduction and the conclusion is just to stay within the academic paradigm of writing this assessment with the elements by opening up, briefly saying what you're going to be doing, and then closing off by commenting on sort of what you've done and perhaps one or two key issues that you want to raise. So elements of the action process used, and the word count, as I mentioned here, will be or is indicative of the word count relative to the formula that I gave you earlier of whatever the mark is divided by 90, which is the marks allocated from 1 to 6. The 10 other marks are allocated for the APA and so on. So these are allocated according to the word count. So, for example, with the appreciative inquiry, at what stage would that have been useful? You have, let's say roughly 100 words to write here. And you can see here you need to be very thoughtful in writing your answer to do justice to this question, and then also identify the stage and then motivate it. Remember, I think there was a motivation associated with this. So you need to be a very good writer. And hopefully you can also see if you're going to be aiming at 1800 words, you're probably not going to write enough of substance in the various areas. And as mentioned, there are people that can write very effectively in less words than others, but in my experience, that is the exception rather than the rule. Okay, so you can go through this. This is on the MySACAP, and this is exactly 2,000 words, including the headings. And then please do take note of the reference style. I've got these examples for you, and yours must please be in APA format, which is also part of the academic rigor that you can display. So this has been nearly an hour. Hopefully this is of value to you, and then I will wish you well for the assessment. So take care.